fun, but be a little harsh to an IGN review of Dune. It does note a lot of positives in the film, but it's extremely critical. And I'd agree with the criticisms, but the basis of the criticisms I think are really, really silly or not well founded. The upshot is the critic is going to try to say that the problem is the film was a little too close to the books. But then when it tries to explain how or why, it kind of reveals I don't think you understand the books, or at least not at a very deep level. But let's hear the person speak and then respond.
To be clear, the on-screen title of this installment is actually Dune Part 1, as the decision was made to divide the sprawling novel into 2 parts. This results in an adaptation that allows many of the book's smaller moments and supporting characters to breathe more, but also is perhaps too devoted to Herbert's work. Heresy, yells the Frank Herbert fan, but we all know that what works in a book might not work in a movie and vice versa. And Villeneuve's biggest misstep with Dune Part 1 is how misshapen and plotting it feels in its second half, as if the movie doesn't quite know how or where to end before it just suddenly does. Unfortunately, the filmmakers don't always succeed on this same front moving forward. Still, Villeneuve frequently impresses with his ability to take tried and true sci-fi concepts and put some new spin on them. His take on the powers of the Bene Gesserit, for example, lead to a moment that's wonderfully off-putting and effective. The script also benefits from injecting occasional bits of humor into the universe-shaping events of the film.
Okay, well, let's go through these issues carefully. Not all of them, because that's a lot. Let's just take a few. There's not a lot of Shawnee. I know some people are challenging me on this, that it should be Chaney or Channy or whatever. I'm sorry, I'm going to call her Shawnee. Apologies. Well, Shawnee is not that much in the books, at least in those early stages. She's being saved off for quite a while, and her doing the voiceover narration is not in the books. So I'm really puzzled as to what you mean by he's sticking too close to what Frank Herbert did. He is clearly departing from Frank Herbert in a lot of ways, small and large. Just to take a few examples, with the ornithopters, they now have a kind of dragonfly design. That's not in the first book. They're clearly said to have a much more bug design in terms of being circular or oval or round. Then he's taken that away. The House Atreides color is red. That's very absent. We see Lady Jessica in red, but most of the uniforms are dark blue or gray. So again, then he's taking that away. So you just going through the trailers carefully, both the main one and the foreign one, he's changed a ton of detail. So he's not sticking to the books, rigorously. He's letting a lot of things go. But let's concentrate on the Bene Gesserit, because that's a big one. And we want to be clear, there are some ambiguities, but you don't want to say what they have are powers, because that implies that they're superhuman. They are not. Although it seems like the voice and other things are like powers, they're really just abilities that they sharpened generation after generation through a lot of training, a lot of concentration. And calling them powers, I think, betrays, again, either you didn't read the book or you read it at a very superficial level that, it's these superpowered beings fighting one another. Now, that is technically true in the later books, like Children of Dune. You could argue Leto II does basically become a very superpowered human being. That's not really true of Paul, even. He has access to visions, but again, those visions do have limits, and there are certain conditions where they will work or not work. They can also be blocked by Edric and others. So, again, what I find really interesting is that a lot of the negative reviews coming out with Dune is they're taking a common tack that Denis made a fatal mistake just sticking too close to Herbert and not translating it to the screen effectively. I will agree with one thing, because this is becoming very uniformal. Even people who like the film do complain that the ending is just too abrupt. Now, if Denis made this mistake and he made it, then he is responsible, and yes, we shouldn't just paper that over and say, oh, that's, these ignorant people. He had to choose what the ending would be. But I'm getting more and more the impression that what this critic wanted and the other critics wanted was more of a fantastic, explosive ending, whereas the probable ending we're getting with the Jameis fight and Paul being integrated into the Fremen was just kind of like, that's it? It feels a little, where's the spark? Where's the cliffhanger that's going to get us to the next part of the story? Well, you're going to force into a binary, right? Because it is not in the book. Yes, him being integrated into the Fremen is in the book. But I never felt a lack of excitement or a lack of narrative momentum. I think people are just getting confused about what Dune is. Dune does have an adventure story. The adventure story is a means to an end to talk about power and politics and ecology. It is not really about the adventure story itself. This is true of Lord of the Rings as well. It's not really about Frodo getting to a magical mountain and dropping a ring. That's all surface. That's all allegory. I know some people like quoting that great quote from Tolkien that he hates allegories. That's not true. It is an allegory. It's just a very deep one. It's about human choice and corruption. The ring is a symbol of those things. He just does such a masterful job of constructing the story, you don't notice that. But anybody with a brain notices that the plot has a lot of problems because of course, the eagle issue. So yeah, at the level of plot, this makes no sense. They're not concerned with that. Herbert did a great plot, but its point is to emphasize the theme. You don't want to get caught up in terms of like, what does everything really make logical sense? Does every detail really work out? That's not the point of the book. The point of the novel was to force you to confront certain prejudices you have about power and a hero and how he can save or redeem a society. And do you really want that to happen? So it seems that's what the critics did want. They wanted a more traditional kind of ending with, I guess, Paul maybe fighting the beast or him working with the Fremen to raid a Harkonian base. They just wanted some action-oriented ending that would really get their thirst going for the next part of the story. But that's not what the story. It's not about the plot. You can change aspects of the plot. Yeah, maybe it would be interesting if Paul faced the beast earlier on. Like, listen, I like the Darth Maul fight in Phantom Menace. I think it's one of the greatest sequences I've ever seen. But that's good for that story. This is not a Force user facing the Sith. That is not the story that Frank Herbert is telling, or that Denis wants to tell either. It's not about staying faithful to the plot as much as what is the plot serving. The plot is serving the story. The story is about ecology. I guess people just find ecology itself boring, but that is the story. It's not meant to be a bunch of explosive action adventure set pieces. That is not what the story is. But I'm going to have to wait to see the film myself, but it just feels over and over again. People just keep going back to that. This is too faithful to the books and it's too boring in terms of the later stages of the film. But again, staying faithful to the book does not mean it is boring. What is boring about it? That's a lot of growth and a lot of momentous decision making that Paul decides to join the Fremen. Maybe it just wasn't communicated effectively, and if so, that's Denis' fault. But it just seems the critics wanted a certain kind of ending and a certain kind of story and weren't looking at the story they have in front of them. And to me, that's not the job of the critic. You can do that later and another kind of critique, but if your job is to examine the story as it is, you don't keep inserting, this is what the story should be. It's not meant to be an MCU film. It's not meant to be an MCU story. It's not meant to be a Star Wars story. It's meant to be its own story, and it should be judged appropriately. And it just seems a lot of critics are bringing in prejudices to bear and then saying this is a failure according to that standard. But is that standard the right one? Apparently so, and they're not willing to question it. And I think that's being a little too dogmatic with what Herbert is up to and what Denis is up to as well, at least in my humble opinion. Thanks for listening.